We're really thrilled to have you all to come and hear a recap of our experiences at COP26. My name is Jeremy Murphy. I'm a principal with Sustainability Solutions Group, and I'm based in the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations lands here in post-colonial Vancouver. And we have Yul Herbert and Carol Fraser, who are also presenting as part of the SSG team today, and they will introduce themselves when it's their turn to talk. We also have lots of other members of SSG and What If Technologies, our partners on most of our climate action work. And we're located all across Canada and all across the Americas now, into the US and into Chile as well. And I see that there are lots of people from a lot of the places where we have done work or where we're currently working, and even where we hope to do some work one day soon. It's great to see you all. It's like a little mini international conference we're having here. It's very exciting. So thank you all for joining. Introduce yourself in the chat. We're going to be sharing our COP26 experiences in the, as it's known, the blue zone, in the green zone, and otherwise. And importantly, we're going to be distilling our takeaways from COP26 in Glasgow and how they really apply to cities. There's a million takeaways from this huge conference, and we've tried to boil it down to what we feel are some of the most important for cities. So thanks again for joining. And I think with that, we can get going. So Yul, I'll leave it to you to take us through the COP experience.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So I'm Yul, also principal at SSG, and I'm going to try and help you imagine what it's like at the COP and then talk about some of the key outcomes. And so actually, if you just go back one, imagine that you take thousands of people, literally 37,000 in this case, who are passionate about climate change, throw them into an inflatable tent with a fake green carpet and lock them in there for 2 weeks and tell them they can only talk about climate change, and you start to get a picture of what the COP is like. And so anyone who really is fascinated by climate policy, it is the place to go to learn about new ideas and to have really rich and creative discussions. And I've attended 4 or more COPs now, and I think Glasgow is really unique, and we'll try and highlight that story a little bit. So if you go to the next slide, I've described COP as a veggie burger. And if you think of the core aspect of the veggie burger being the patty, which is really the formal negotiations, which countries send their delegations to debate different elements of the agreements. But then you have on the bottom the bun, which is protests, and that's a key part of setting the pressure on the negotiators. And then you also have on the top another part of the bun, which are typically informal people's summits, as it was called in Glasgow, where all sorts of ideas are being discussed more from a social justice perspective. So they kind of sandwich the formal negotiations. But you also have a very strong business constituency, more at this COP than ever before. Many CEOs, so much that deal making was actually a really big part of the COP. Maybe that's lettuce. Then you have a bunch of interlocutors, if I'm going to say that word properly, like Obama and Prince Charles and Leonardo DiCaprio and all these people who kind of inject some form of energy in negotiations. You have a bunch of observers events, and this is nonprofit organizations who are sharing ideas and in pavilions and side events throughout. And you have a lot of parties that happen, or at least pre-COVID you did, and just to a lesser degree at this COP, where people get to know each other. And then perhaps the mustard, some bad actors, and these can be countries like Canada and the US have played that role previously. They didn't at this COP, but also fossil fuel lobbyists who are basically trying to undermine the effort. So you get this crazy metaphor of the COP as a veggie burger. Hopefully that can linger in your mind. Go to the next slide. So just to situate this COP in the UN formal process, these are Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And they happen every year. And there's been a number of key ones: Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris, and Glasgow. And the paradigm pre-Paris was that there would be a mandate given to countries to set targets. So countries had to live up to a target that was established through some methodology. This was overturned in Paris. And the idea was that countries would just do what they can, and they would establish their own targets. And that was the notion of nationally determined contributions. And that was a real breakthrough for the negotiations, because it recognized that UN can't really impose targets on countries. Countries are sovereign states. So it kind of unleashed countries to succumb to peer pressure in setting their targets. Paris also identified 1.5 degrees, and Glasgow reinforced 1.5 degrees. So we really are now focused on 1.5 degrees. 2 degrees is not really a target that anyone's talking about anymore. And to get to 1.5 degrees, Paris introduced the notion of a ratchet. So targets need to increase their target, or countries need to increase their target over time. And Glasgow, again, was an opportunity to do that, and many states lived up to that. So on the next slide, so the context was fascinating, because we had this report from the International Energy Agency, which is the primary reference body for most governments and energy companies around the world, that landed like a bomb before the COP, indicating that we no longer need any investments in new oil and gas and coal. So that sort of resonated throughout the negotiations. We had the IPCC report, which they do every 5 years on science, which was basically a code red for humanity. And then I think of most influence was the Friday for Futures protests, which sort of echoed throughout the halls of the negotiations on an ongoing basis. These particular words from Greta Thunberg, blah, 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 was sort of in everyone's mind, which all culminated in, as Sir Richard Attenborough described in his opening speech, as sort of desperate hope. And that was the tone of the negotiations, which lingers on. If you go to the next slide, there's, as I mentioned, 37,000 people attending COP despite COVID, the most of any COP so far. And many people from Southern countries were unable to attend, and described as sort of a great injustice of this COP. But that led to massive lineups. If you keep going to the next slide, for accreditation, which is the formal security process. And the UN is meant to be a very transparent fora. And so many people from NGOs and government delegations all mixed together in these kind of rooms, this one with the earth lingering over everyone's heads. If you go to the next slide, we work with many city councils, which usually are 10 to 20 people. And it's very seldom that you get a consensus or a unanimous council decision. But the UN had the audacity to require that any agreement on climate, most thorny problem we could ever confront, must receive consensus of 180 countries. So in this 2 weeks, 180 countries have to come to consensus on all of the technical details and broad vision for solving the climate problem, which to me is like the most idealistic, audacious, crazy paradigm you can ever imagine for setting up negotiations. And the remarkable thing is they do it. So it really changes what you think about the way you set up climate negotiations. If you keep going, this is some of the country for booths that exist within the UN setup. Everyone uses different architecture, and there's a program of ideas that runs 12 hours a day at each of these booths from many different countries. Another thing that was different, next slide, was the presence of the US, which was very constructive, as is highlighted by this quote. You keep going. Outside the blue zone, which is the formal session, there were many creative protests. This one, several 100,000 people marching for climate action. Keep going. As well as many different programs for the public. This is the green zone, which had a steady stream of sessions and movies and demonstrations of different strategies to address climate change. And that became the next slide, on the streets. So for the first time, we've talked with many municipalities about electrification of their fleets. Here was an electric police car right on the streets of Glasgow. So that was kind of interesting to see happening in real time. Go to the next slide. I'm going to zip through 9 of the formal outcomes of the COP. Next slide. The first one is that we really established 1.5 degrees as the target. So it's no longer about 2 degrees, as highlighted by this quote from the speech of the Prime Minister of Barbados. From her perspective, 2 degrees is the death sentence. And that was reinforced in the final declaration by the Glasgow Climate Compact, or Climate Pact. If you go to the next slide. However, the commitments for targets from countries, while they increased, many countries submitted increased NDCs, including the US, the UK, and others, there's still a major gap between the targets and in particular between the pledges or the actual policies and action that countries have put forward. And so that's why the ratcheting mechanism is really critical, which countries are supposed to come back with increased ambition to the next COP next year. If you go to the next slide, for the first time, fossil fuels was actually included in the statement issued by all of the countries at the end. So that has been, countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others have blocked that previously, and that's really a sign that things are shifting. So we're actually able to talk about fossil fuels, the skeleton in the room. If you go to the next slide, equity was the piece that almost sunk the talks because northern countries have promised $100 billion per year in financing to help southern countries adapt, but they have not fulfilled that promise. They almost got there this year, but not quite. So that is a key part, is thinking about international equity, but also this notion of loss and damage, which is the idea of climate reparations. Rich countries have done most of the damage and to the climate, and that is causing many tragedies for southern countries. And so there's a notion that there is a debt owed. And for the first time, Scotland made a symbolic payment as a climate reparation. First time that's ever happened, of around $5 million. In the loss and damage paradigm. So here's some more of the formal outcomes which influence all of our work. The first thing is we now have standard timeframes. So everyone is going to be using the same timeframe. That's never happened before. It's going to be 2025 to 2035, 2030 to 2040. Every 5 years, you're supposed to submit a new target. There's also going to be a new standardization of inventories and reporting and new ways of doing inventories. So that's going to be really interesting to watch. Targets are going to keep increasing in ambition, which Jeremy will talk about in a bit more. India submitted a target which was game-changing from most people's perspective. They haven't not been willing to do that previously, even though it's net zero by 2070, that still was considered a milestone. And the last thing is that all targets from all countries need to align with 1.5, and that has not happened previously as well. Keep going. There's a new formal regime for carbon trading, which lacks a key component around human rights, including for First Nations, but there will be international markets for carbon trading for the first time that are managed by the UN process. Just transition was a key element, and there's a precedent-setting agreement where a number of countries are financing an $8 billion transformation of South Africa's electricity grid with a just transition framework, which was a really interesting precedent. And then the last one is that the US and China are talking about climate, despite all the other diplomatic messes between those two countries right now. So that's a really hopeful international point of cooperation. And next slide. There were a whole bunch of coalitions of the willing, and these are countries and other actors who are getting together to move more quickly than the UN process. And there's a lot of richness in these. I won't be able to go through them in all detail, but some of the important ones are coal, with Power and Pass Coal Alliance, which Canada is part of, a deforestation agreement between which Canada and the US were both part of, as well as many other countries. The breakthroughs I'll talk about in a sec. The global methane pledge is a really important and very affordable way to address a key greenhouse gas emission, and that's got a lot of attention and financing. The fossil fuel financing phase out is also a really fascinating one. As of next year, no international agencies are supposed to put money into any fossil fuel projects. And I'll talk about the Glasgow Financial Alliance in a sec as well. Keep going. And zero emissions cars. So the breakthrough agreement was basically by 2030, those countries that signed on committed to clean power by 2030, zero emissions road transportation as much as possible by 2030, and a strategy around zero emission steel, which is really empowering that sector, and also green hydrogen, which puts a lot more effort behind green hydrogen. So I think those will have trickle down into all national policies and have a transformative impact. In some cases, there's a lot of momentum already, in particular in zero emissions vehicles. Another really key piece was this new alliance called Beyond Oil and Gas, which is about production rather than consumption. A number of states have committed to phasing out oil and gas production, and that is a highly symbolic and also practical move by those countries, and I expect that will grow pretty quickly. And that's also supported by this new effort to create a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which Canada or Vancouver and Toronto have already signed on to in Canada, but there's a lot of presence from that effort as well. And if we keep going, the last piece I wanted to hit was the Glasgow Financial Alliance. And this was really sending a signal that financial markets are no longer going to finance fossil fuels and are going to shift towards low carbon or zero emissions technologies. And it was Mark Carney brokered this arrangement, and it was $130 trillion of investors committed to having 1.5 degree aligned portfolios by 2030. And so everyone thinks this is a really important signal, although there's many details missing and lots of sort of accusations of greenwashing and indicating that the whole effort was not necessarily substantive. But I think from a symbol perspective, it was really important. So we're going to be watching how this rolls out really carefully. And then my last slide before passing it over is that I think this was a pivotal COP in that the previous paradigm was really climate action as pain, as sacrifice. And now there's a real sense that climate action is an opportunity, and that opportunity plays out in all sorts of ways. It's supported by all these positive feedback cycles that are underway in finance and policies and technology. There's still major hurdles to overcome in terms of inertia from governments and lock-in from fossil fuel companies, but there is a type of momentum and a paradigm that at least I've never witnessed before. So over to you, Carol.
Great. Thanks, Yul. So I'm Carol Fraser. I'm the new SSG's new US focused business development lead and consultant. So I'm looking forward to working with you all more. And I'm going to speak a little bit about some exciting and innovative approaches that we learned during our time at COP26 that are helping cities solve key climate action issues. So the first area, next slide, is around effective building retrofits. So globally, building and construction accounts for 37% of energy and CO2 emissions, including both direct operational and indirect embodied carbon sources. So retrofits can help address this source of emissions. And during official and unofficial COP26 events, we learned about some pretty innovative approaches to retrofits that cities are using and that we want to share with you. Next slide. So this was really front and center, especially retrofits are really front and center, especially on cities, regions, and the built environment, which is an entire day at COP26 devoted to cities figuring out how to address these kinds of issues. Next slide, please. And a key focus during these sessions was governments asking themselves and each other and the private sector, how do we actually do building retrofits in a way that's quick, that's at the scale that we need, that's effective, and that's equitable in order to meet the stated social and climate goals that they have. So representatives from New York State in this photo talked about the need for retrofitting 200,000 buildings a year between now and 2030 in order to meet their goals. And right now they're only doing a tenth of that. So they were really struggling to think through, okay, how are we going to scale this up in a major way? Next slide. So some of the major themes that they identified and kind of the key lessons from government leaders of all levels in terms of retrofits. One, the need for equitable approaches. So this is from program design all the way through implementation. They talked about identifying what they're doing that's not working, and also who's currently not benefiting from or even participating in retrofit programs. They also discussed the need to work intergovernmentally, collaboratively, leveraging provincial and state and national funding sources, as well as existing resources in their community, including community members themselves, which we'll get into in a moment. And finally, there was a need to think outside the building, so to speak, think outside the box and shift the paradigms around retrofits, including the processes at the government level, so that we break out of silos and we kind of create new organizing structures to get retrofits done. Next slide. So in terms of a government level retrofit and retrofitting government buildings, there's a need to move away from thinking of each retrofit as a unique snowflake, so to speak. Rather, there's a need to kind of industrialize across all of the municipal assets, not necessarily keeping with the paradigm of a retrofit taking 5 years from start to finish, but instead identifying groups or clusters of buildings with similar types, for example, the high emitters or the buildings in critical conditions, and figuring out ways to address those all at once in an industrialized way. Next slide, please. in terms of addressing the retrofit challenge of residential buildings within cities. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a top-down approach. And one of the most exciting and interesting models that we heard about during COP26 was really community-led organizations that are addressing this challenge. So People-Powered Retrofit, based in the UK, is a membership-based community benefit organization where the people whose homes are getting retrofitted, the homeowners and renters, are actually an integral part of the entire retrofit process. And they're actually members of this organization. So they're not just customers or kind of beneficiaries or end users, but they're actually partners throughout the whole process. Next slide, please. So the way it works is that individuals can join the organization, which is structured as a co-op. And this way they access retrofit consulting services, which are offered by some of the partners in the initiative who are specialists in this regard. And these partners work with the homeowners and renters to identify the ways that they can retrofit their own dwellings, as well as connecting them with the relevant suppliers and contractors in their area. Next slide. So the result is a community-centered approach that empowers the residents to be involved in building decarbonization, while also building up local supply chains and job skills so that retrofits can scale up really quickly within a community, and there isn't even necessarily a need for a large government subsidy or program or involvement. Next slide. So to accelerate these kind of bottom-up community retrofit solutions, these are some of the keys to success and understanding why this model is really special and different. It really is a whole new approach to mobilizing community assets. It's empowering the residents in the community to be involved, to improve their energy literacy. It builds trust between residents and suppliers because they know, as being members of the organization, who is coming into their home, who is advising them, and there's kind of a trust within the community for those suppliers and contractors. It also taps into a new source of investment, which is the public, which is residents themselves as a way to finance this kind of retrofit scheme. And then because of the co-op structure, any of the kind of proceeds or profits from this organization are actually staying in the local community and building community wealth. So now we'll move on to some innovative approaches we heard about in terms of decarbonizing transportation during COP26. So EVs, electric vehicles, were a huge focus, but there were a lot of other solutions that we heard about that don't involve EVs and are actually kind of focused on improving equity, creating jobs, increasing quality of life. So one of the examples we heard about from Stephen Arnold, pictured here, he's from the city of Birmingham in the UK, and he was speaking about their clean air zone. So the key to implementing their clean air zone in Birmingham was actually not a focus on climate change or emissions. It was a focus on air quality, public health, especially children's public health, traffic noise, traffic congestion. These are really tangible things that are a little bit easier to grasp onto than some abstract climate emissions target. So that's a key to success. And another key was thinking about the equity implications, both in program design, thinking about the congestion charges and the exceptions, and then also what they do with the actual fees that they're levying. They're able to reinvest those back into equitable access to electric vehicles or bikes or public transit, which was a really interesting way of doing it. So speaking of clean air zones, that's one way of addressing traffic jams, but maybe this is what the traffic jam of the future could look like in some cities. Well, next slide, Jack Skillen of Team London Bridge certainly thinks that's a possibility. He worked with the London Borough of Southwark to develop a Bikes for Business program. So this is a really interesting solution because it's actually supporting and incentivizing businesses in that borough in the ultra low emissions zone to use cargo bikes for both last mile freight and passenger delivery. So this program, the companies that are engaged in it, next slide, find that there's a lot of benefits of doing this, again, outside of carbon emissions. They find that when they use cargo bikes, it's easier for their employees to find parking. They end up being more sociable with customers, actually enjoy their jobs more. And it can be a lot faster in a really congested city to get around with the cargo bike rather than a van and have to find parking. Next slide. The program also showcases and highlights business creativity and branding. There's many different kinds of bikes and ways to use them. So it actually adds a lot of dynamism and life to a city's streets to have this kind of initiative. And finally, it results in some happy customers. This is actually me and my mom getting a ride on one of the bikes. And let me tell you, it was really fun. So there's that aspect as well. Now I'll tell you a little bit about some really interesting approaches to renewable energy generation across the world, actually. So we know that renewable energy is key to climate action and achieving the goals. And there's this really important consideration in terms of investment in these initiatives. So municipalities are looking for investors. Next slide. Well, why not the public? This is kind of the theme that came out of a few initiatives we saw. So after all, the public, the residents, are people who are actually using the energy. And what we saw at COP were projects that are people-driven, community-based, actually engage and empower people to help drive the transition to renewable energy, which makes them feel more part of the movement and contributes to economic development as well. So these kind of initiatives can take a variety of forms. It can be collective investment in solar panels, collective ownership of energy supply or distribution network, and they can be cooperatives, partnerships, companies with community interests, nonprofits, et cetera. One of the models we heard about, which you see here, is the Indigenous Clean Energy Network. These folks were speaking at COP26 about their initiative to assist Indigenous groups across Canada, on the energy transition. So they have almost 200 renewable energy projects, next slide, including hydro, wind, and solar across the country, which is really impressive. We also heard from Dirk Bensenshen from the European Federation of Citizen Energy Cooperatives. They call themselves ResCoop for short. And they have had a huge impact in just 10 years of existence. So they're a network of almost 2,000 European energy cooperatives with over 1.25 million members. And then there's even millions more people that their energy sources are serving. So they've been an advocate for creating more enabling frameworks to make these kinds of projects possible, and they've had a lot of success. The benefit of their model and their approach is that they really focus on community education and, again, that kind of grassroots bottom-up approach to renewable energy. So they raise awareness with communities of this kind of model as a possibility, and then also educate people on how to do it themselves. It's very empowering. And this is really interesting because it can get through some of the issues around opposition oftentimes to renewable energy projects in community. When the communities are directly involved, they sort of sidestep those kinds of issues. And like the other cooperative model that we mentioned for retrofits, this kind of initiative builds community wealth because the proceeds of energy generation or the profits that might be made from that actually kept in the hands of local people rather than large corporations. So to help out with this, can you go back one? ResCoop has developed a practical guide to reclaiming power. This has been used across Europe to develop energy cooperatives, has tons of tips for residents and municipalities for how to scale up their community-owned renewable energy projects. And they've got some tips that are particularly interesting in terms of what the keys to success are, or kind of the indicators of when you're doing this successfully. So when the government is able to come in and facilitate groups to start to develop these kinds of projects, that can be really powerful. When cities and governments are providing sites for the renewable energy projects, for example, on publicly owned buildings for solar panels, that can be really helpful to get these projects started and up and running. And then there's also, of course, the power of the purse. So when governments are procuring energy, they can give preference to community-owned or citizen-owned energy projects like this. So those are some of the interesting approaches we learned about. And now we want to turn it over to Jeremy to talk about kind of the broader implications from COP26 for cities.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carol and Yul. So everyone else, if you have questions, you can start typing them in the chat. We're monitoring it, or just hold it for the end. I'm going to take about 10 minutes here to bring us home, talking about 6 of the key implications for cities. So Yul kind of gave us the flavor for COP and what the major outcomes were. Carol gave us some of the kind of specific on the ground examples of what was working really well for other cities across the world. And I'm going to give you kind of a policy angle for cities, which kind of builds on a lot of the work that we've done with cities on climate action. So I think, as you was mentioning a little bit, you know, there was a lot of different coalitions, a lot of different streams going on at COP26. And one particularly relevant one to our work and to you is the prominence of cities in this COP and coming out of this COP. So the UN, the IPCC have recognized more formally than ever the essential role of cities in climate action. Part of that is as part of the UN's Race to Zero program, which is a program for non-state actors, as they're called, so cities, businesses, the health industry, et cetera, on getting to zero emissions. And there is a new focus on multi-level climate action. So traditionally, the focus has been on nations or sub-national parties, but with the recognition of cities, there's this multi-level climate action pact coming out of this. And there's also talk about integrating city targets into the nationally determined contributions, which would be a first. Typically, that's just at the national level. Maybe it's at the state or province level that aggregates up to the national level. But this would be kind of the first time that city targets are directly considered in this process. So you'll mention that there's a ratcheting mechanism. So nationally determined contributions will ratchet over time. The ambition will increase. So I know a lot of people we've worked with, a lot of cities and regions struggle with the ambition of the net zero by 2050, the 45 to 55% reduction by 2030. But if you think that those targets are currently ambitious, prepare yourselves for more ambition in future years. This is going to ratchet up, and it is going to affect cities' climate planning. One important thing that this means is that cities must avoid all lock-in of fossil fuel use immediately. So we're not talking about over the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to start disallowing new buildings to connect to natural gas lines. We're talking this year or next year, that has to end, or else the cities will never be able to achieve those increasingly ambitious targets. We also heard that EV and renewable energy support is really ramping up. So that's another thing in our work. There's often some skepticism about the EV outlook, the new market sales uptakes of EVs over the next 10 years, the ability to implement renewable energy projects. There are a lot of commitments coming over the next decade coming out of COP26. The financial picture is shifting and the technological picture is shifting very quickly. So this means that cities can have more confidence, I think, in adopting policies around EVs and renewable energy, and they'll find more funding and other opportunities. You will mention the increasing oil and gas stigma, which is getting very real now for the first time, kind of in a very formalized, recognized way. There are these coalitions of governments and subnational governments to phase out fossil fuels completely. That means banning or abandoning oil and gas extraction and its use as well. So I mentioned disallowing new buildings to connect to natural gas lines as an example. This is something that cities can be more confident with now with this shift. The policies around building energy efficiency, around energy sources in those buildings, as well as electric vehicle policies, we can have a little bit more confidence that those will be successful. Importantly, we are hearing more and more that inaction on climate change is becoming a greater and greater legal liability. So many of you are probably familiar with this very wedge diagram I have here, which shows the effect of different actions in terms of their emissions reduction potential and the carbon liability, which remains over time. The larger that carbon liability is, the less action that you have taken as a city or region, the more legal liability you are incurring. So COP26 had a legal precedence discussion around this. Some of it is acknowledging that there are increasing lawsuits against states and nations, often by youth, sometimes by different community groups. and citizen groups. So really, this is saying that cities, they have an obligation to care for current and future generations, and if they can't prove that they're delivering on that obligation, they may be held liable in the future. As was mentioned earlier, private investment is shifting, which has a lot of interesting implications. So one of which is the presence of oil and gas industries in your jurisdiction may become an increased risk over time. The more you rely on kind of fossil fuel resource industries, the more you're kind of putting yourself at risk once that investment shifts away from fossil fuel industry to renewables or other types of climate actions or investments. This is an opportunity for cities to attract investment in their climate change actions. Some of those mechanisms are still being developed, but really creative entrepreneurial cities are trying to figure this out. And importantly, I think it also means that cities can start preparing climate action investment strategies. So not just doing kind of the financial outlook of how much the actions may cost or what the revenues or avoided costs will be, but also kind of what are we going to invest in here? Where is that money going to come from? What is the overall investment strategy for our community? And finally, we've been hearing more and more, but we heard it loud and clear at this COP, that methane reduction is crucial, and it is more important than we ever acknowledged before. I think most of us know that methane has a higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide, even though most of our municipal and regional climate actions focus on carbon dioxide emissions. What we're learning is that methane is more omnipresent than thought and is more powerful than we knew. The image is Boston and all of the methane leaks all over the natural gas system in Boston. It is very significant. And that map could be made for any city with a natural gas distribution system. So we need to fix the leaks is one thing, but more importantly, we need to transition away from natural gas. It's quite evident that it is not a transition fuel, that it is more destructive than we gave it credit to previously. And finally, again, if there are industrial activities in your regions, it's something that cities have to address more directly, recognizing in our work that cities often don't have a lot of leverage over industry, and that it's often more of a provincial or state level responsibility. Cities and states need to work together to form partnerships with industry to tackle those emissions. So those are kind of 6 of the really key things I think we can take away and get working on in our policy. So we kind of got a little bit of a flavor for how COP worked and what came out of COP26. Some innovations that cities are seeing across the globe, and then some policies that we can get working on here. And I thought that this was a nice sentiment that we saw from one of the booths in the green zone at COP. For those of you who haven't seen it, this is the graphic, this visual display of annual average temperature over the past couple hundred years, with it getting redder and redder toward the right of the screen as global temperatures warm. But what we heard was that to address this warming, this global heating, to take climate action, it's not just nation states, it's not just subnational actors, it's everybody, it's cities, it's our different regions, it's the coalitions of the willing, the businesses, it's everybody shifting investment, shifting effort, and really pulling together to make this happen. I thought this was a great sentiment, and really everywhere we went in COP26. So that was a race. We had a lot to convey to you, and it was only a small fraction, of course, of everything we could have conveyed. We would like to hear from you, your questions, your thoughts on all of this. We have about 15, 16 minutes here. You can type it in the chat. You can raise your hand, and Vesta will direct who is asking questions.
All right, so I think we'll just start with some questions from the chat, and then people just feel free to use the raise hand functionality if you have something to add or ask. So let's start with a question from Hillary, wondering if EU power providers are similar to Canadian ones. She says that, for example, in Saskatchewan, they have a power provider that basically has a monopoly in the province, and they make all the rules for things like clean power generation. And Emily from New Brunswick also says that there are similar limitations there. So Yul, I think you started answering that in chat. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different jurisdictions that Res Co-op in the EU is operating in, and some of them had similar challenges. But what Res Co-op has been really successful in is actually creating enabling policy in the EU. They have, I mean, I think they've been an incredibly successful lobby effort to demonstrate the value of local renewable energy cooperatives, and they have really supported programs in many jurisdictions now. So I think that's been the key piece that they use to overcome that barrier. But there's also been other strategies like solar gardens and net metering approaches and others that they have been sort of working around those kind of limitations. And I think even some microgrids, like they're incredibly creative and diverse.
So we have a question from Spencer saying, what do you see as the municipality's role in facilitating and encouraging these types of grassroots energy co-ops? Carol, did you have some insights in that, or Yul or Jeremy?
Well, I think on the most basic level, it's, you know, you can use anything from demonstrating that this is possible, or kind of like what Yul was just saying, okay, looking at the policies in your area and figuring out what needs to be overcome, doing that in partnership with community groups who might be interested in doing that. So you can convene people, you can bring people together, you can highlight some of the projects that are already going on here in Canada through the Indigenous Clean Energy Network, for example, or Res Co-ops. That would be the first step that I would recommend.
Cool. So we have a question from Janice. Have you heard if the feds are planning to give cities the authority to limit natural gas expansion? Jeremy, do you have any insight on that?
Oh, that would be a tricky thing coming from the federal government for sure. So I don't think we've heard any such potential strategy or policy coming from the federal government, to my knowledge. I don't know, Yul, if you have any other thoughts on that?
I guess maybe indirectly through net zero building codes, but I think there's a number of municipalities across Canada exploring how they can use the tools they have to limit natural gas connections right now. And we're kind of watching that carefully and seeing what kind of creative approaches people come up with. I think Toronto is going to be really diving into that in the next little while as
well. Was there any discussion around what cities need from senior levels of government? Mike Fletcher asks.
I can jump in on that one. There's a whole stream, and actually cities are formally recognized in the UN process as a key partner under one of the negotiating tracks. And they have a whole agenda, which is usually, there's a few different organizations who kind of advocate on behalf of cities, including ICLEI and ULG, which is the Union of Local Governments, and a couple others who sort of really drive that agenda. But I mean, as well as many nonprofits and us, even to some degree, we are also pushing that agenda. But I think that in particular in Canada, that's tricky because municipalities are a creature of the province, who's a creature of the federal government. So it gets really tricky. But certainly the role of cities is increasingly recognized in the UN process and increasingly highlighted every COP. It becomes more and more prominent as they have a bigger and bigger role. And C40 really highlighted the role of cities at the COP. They had a steady stream of mayors from across the world coming through, highlighting different activities. There was many panels on cities and how they are enabled or disabled, as the case may be, to take climate action. So I don't think there was like a really clear agenda. It'd be really fun to develop one. What if you really are serious about climate internationally, what should you do to empower cities to really move forward? I think that would be a really fun agenda to create. So looking forward to your ideas on that one.
Speaking of C40, there's a question from Hillary on, was there any talk of carbon budgeting from the policy side? So Yul, I think that's probably you.
Or Carol.
Okay.
Yeah, we met with and heard about C40's new pilot to do carbon budgets with 11 cities around the world. So carbon budgets, for those who don't know, are a way of aligning your city's financial systems and processes with your climate action plans and goals. So you can actually look at, okay, how much carbon is left for this city to emit in order to meet our goals. It's kind of the inverse of that wedge diagram. And then how are we going to get there year over year? We SSG actually worked with Edmonton on their carbon budget, and that is a 4-year carbon budgeting process that moves through the entire financial management system of the city. So it is an exciting new model, and C40 is certainly, they're doing a pilot, they're figuring out the best practices for other cities to do it. And I think they're going to expand that to more and more cities in their network. So it's something to look out for. And there's going to be resources coming out of that too, which is great.
If I can just add to that too, I did talk to the UK Climate Change Commission, which sets the carbon budgets for the UK government. And it was really fascinating to compare notes about their process and then how that downscales to cities and what they've been finding working. And I mean, that's a whole nother long conversation, but I think there's lots. I think they're the only national government that I know of that's using a carbon budget approach right now, but it's been very successful for them.
We have a question from Sean. One slide mentions standardized GHG accounting being a theme. Does that mean that there may be incoming amendments to the GPC protocol?
Yeah, so the GPC is based on UNFCCC or IPCC GHG inventory reporting approaches. And there was a lot of discussion about that, which I hadn't realized was such a big issue, but the way in which people are conducting inventories are very, very inaccurate, whether it's national government or subnational government. And so Al Gore has launched a major project, which was announced at the COP, called Climate Trace, which is to redo the whole GHG tracking system fundamentally using satellites. And I mean, I don't know if it'll be fundamental because there'll be probably some calibration between inventories and these satellite data reporting. But it's actually a major problem. There's been, I don't know if it's a problem for every country, but certainly a lot of the countries' inventories are not at all realistic. And so I think that's part of where this piece is coming, because if you look at the UN system as a whole, it's all built on trust. And so if you can't trust the inventories, the whole thing starts falling apart. And so that's really was a major focus of the negotiations, is how do we build more integrity into what countries are self-reporting as are their emissions and ensure that they actually are. And so I think there's going to be a lot of focus on that. I mean, they made that commitment at this COP, but they haven't figured out the technical details. And so that will then trickle down into the IPCC guidelines for inventories, which will then trickle into the GPC guidelines. So it'll have a cascading effect, but I imagine it'll take a couple of years to sort it out.
There's a question here around waste from Francois. Are there any discussions surrounding how we address the impacts of landfill gases, processing and facility energy requirements, how we can tackle the waste at the source rather than at the end? Sort of anything on that topic?
There's a major theme around circular economy. I didn't follow that at all. I don't think anyone on our team did, but there was a ton of people who were focused on that. So I think, yeah, we could certainly check that out and see what discussions are happening, but it was definitely a major point of discussion.
We are almost running out of time here, so I might just make this the final question. It's pretty broad, from Jade, that says, what in your opinion are 5 big initiatives that municipalities generally can or you anticipate will be doing in the next 2 to 5 years? So maybe we can give a couple each.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that question really depends on your municipality and what your emission sources are. So, I mean, we've done a lot of work with resource municipalities, or like industrial based municipalities, for example. And in those municipalities, often the industrial emissions dwarf all of the other emissions of the municipality combined. So if you are one of those municipalities or regions that has a big industrial sector, that's really going to have to be your focus, and it's hard to act on that focus with industry typically. But we're seeing the transition away from natural gas, so bringing those solutions to industrial partners and making those partnerships through working groups or whatever the means is, and leading it as a municipality is going to be increasingly important. I think for more generally, both for those municipalities and municipalities that don't have large industrial content, what we're seeing across our projects and kind of what we saw at COP as well is that the retrofit agenda is really huge, and the transportation emissions agenda is really huge. So figuring out how to scale up retrofits really quickly, at minimum, that means shifting away from fossil fuel energy systems in buildings. And at best, it means doing that and envelope retrofits and commissioning. And then in the transportation sector, it is about mode shifting to active transportation and transit, of course. But there are some trips that are just very difficult to deal with, and those will have to be electrified. And so we'll see a large emissions drop if we can electrify and go to zero emissions vehicles. Yul and Carol, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
I guess I would really encourage everyone to follow the finance stuff, and I'll put an organization that is a really good one to follow in the chat. But I think I'd never realized this until I started participating in COPs, but how much finance drives so many agendas, and finance is really shifting quickly. And I think it could be incredibly disruptive to a lot of the economy, like resource-based economies in particular. So tracking that across the system, I think, and just following those discussions is a really important. For example, a whole new accounting standard was launched at COP so that climate risk can be embedded into financial accounts. So there's all these and that's being required for publicly traded companies in a number of countries starting right away. So there's some really interesting, they're kind of subtle and a bit nerdy, but I think they're going to have a huge impact.
Yeah, maybe just building on that, I think carbon budgets will probably become something that more cities and governments pursue, especially with C40's pilot going on. It's just that, like what you were saying, the financial aspect, not only of private investment, but what cities are actually doing with their money and their capital and operating expenses is really crucial.
All right, Jeremy, as chair, do you think we can take another question, or do you want to do a...
Yeah, do we have time? Yeah, we have time. Let's take another question. We can squeeze it in.
Okay. So going back to the question of standardization, there's a question around, was there any discussion specifically about worldwide standardization? For example, tooling, metric containers, product labeling, etc.
Not that I heard of exactly, but the carbon border tariffs is another piece that's emerging that's really interesting, that will influence. It's kind of a different form of, it's like GHG impacts of trade that has implications for products like that. So for example, the EU just announced that they're looking at, and I think the US is looking at a carbon border tariff as well. If you're in a regime where you make low carbon steel and it's more expensive, then you're going to actually put a tariff on imported steel that isn't low carbon. And that's going to have big implications for lots of material flows internationally. And I think the EU has just committed to do that like in the last week or so.
I think that's an interesting question for a lot of cities' climate action work and the work that we do as well. We're getting questions like that a lot in terms of how we're accounting for embedded carbon in like construction materials and in all the products we consume that typically are produced and transported from outside the regional or municipal boundaries, but consumed inside. So the accounting metrics for that are being developed, I think, and the kind of international agreements on that are also being developed. So we'll expect to see more of that in inventories in the future, I think.
And this might be the real last question. Was there any discussion about municipal fossil fuel divestment with respect to pension plans?
There's certainly a big theme around divestment, and I think there's been a steady stream of new announcements on divestment, even the last couple of weeks. I forget the last one I heard, but I didn't hear explicitly municipal, but certainly municipalities are a big part. I think it's been more in the US. I don't know, Carol, if you have any comments on that.
I can't remember the specific city either, but it's certainly increasing.
Yeah. And I think it's now become, and this is another kind of symbol of where the COP was at in the trajectory of global climate action, is that it's like divestment is now just a risk management approach, because having money in fossil industries is a big risk. That money is very, actually Shell just pulled out of a major gas project in the North Sea off the UK last week, citing financial risk. So those kind of decisions are happening all over the place, and they're sending signals to investors, and investors are getting increasingly worried. So if you have a big pension fund, holding money in fossil fuels is increasingly seen as a financial risk. So I think that's how that's really shifting. And there was so many indicators of that at the COP.
Great. So we're at the hour. We got through a lot in 1 hour. And there's much more work to do and much more discussions to have. So thank you so much, everyone. It's great to see around 90 people join us here today. Please be in touch with us if you have questions, and follow up with our newswire, which is in the chat, for some summaries and future interesting tidbits of information from us. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thanks so much.